Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me in Berlin, though not in the same room this week, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, two topics for you all this week. In the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the ongoing hunger crisis in Gaza. But first, we wanted to address the big economic topic in the news. The data point there is $152 billion. That is the amount of money that has already been generated by the Trump administration's tariffs this year. A whole new round of tariffs have now officially gone into effect as we record this on August 7th. The new baseline tariff for goods entering the United States is some 15%. Rates are even higher than that on a variety of countries.
President Donald Trump has once again threatened India with higher tariffs. In a post on Truth Social on Monday, the president said he would raise tariffs on Indian goods from the current 25%.
Swiss leaders traveled to D.C. earlier today after the president said he would slap the country, Switzerland, with a 39% tariff, which is one of the highest.
More than 24 countries will see higher rates than what was proposed in April. Some of the steepest are on imports from Syria, Switzerland, and Iraq.
Canada will also be subject to
That means the entire world is trying to figure out how to negotiate this new trade order that the Trump administration has put into effect, and which it promised to put into effect throughout its presidential campaign last year. We will try to unpack exactly what's going on from our vantage point here in real time as the tariffs are going to effect. Adam, to start off with, I wanted to take a step back and assess all of the warnings about these tariffs that had been made pretty vociferously by economists who warned about the Trump administration's tariffs. They said that they would spark pretty sharp inflation in the United States. Some warned that, shortages would be a result of tariffs. We haven't seen those effects yet. And I'm curious whether we should conclude that the economists were wrong about their assessments of tariffs. I mean, has this experience so far with tariffs taught us something new about economics?
Well, I think the first thing to just say is I feel a little uncomfortable finding myself in the position of defending economics. But I mean, I think we have to in this case. I mean, the key word in your setup there was we haven't seen the effects yet. So, I mean, I think there's no doubt at all that the economists and the economics are right in that they can predict the direction of travel, but it's complicated and it's hard to pin down exactly when it's going to happen. What I mean by that is that all the signs are that the US economy is experiencing a rebound in inflation. Prices are beginning to edge back up. The Fed, which monitors this most closely, held interest rates, didn't reduce them in part because it's concerned about this rebound. And the rebound is exactly where you'd expect it to be, namely on the goods side, not the services side, because the goods are the traded bit. And normally they exert downward pressure because global competition drives goods prices down. And in this case, they're having the opposite effect. So the telltale signs are there, but the lags are long and variable, as the monetary economists like to say. In other words, it could take a while for the full effect to be felt. In fact, it could take months, quarters, as much as a year would not be surprising in some sectors where you really have to grind through complex supply chains. And there is an element of bargaining about this, about bargaining power. And this is what the Trump administration endlessly harps on. This is this phrase they use where they say, oh no, the foreigners are going to eat the tariff, by which they mean that people supplying American markets with goods have the option of either passing through the tariff and risking loss of market share or just loss of markets because people won't be able to afford Mexican, Brazilian, Chinese goods at the higher prices, or they can swallow some of the increased cost into their own profit margin. And then they'll, of course, in the longer term, have to decide whether they really want to stay in the market or not. So this will take some time to work its way through, but I don't think there's any question that in the end, the effect will be bad. This is like Brexit, right? The sky didn't fall immediately, but the consequences for the British economy over the medium term have been really bad. And I don't think there's really any serious doubt that the consequences for the US economy of these tariffs, notably for US consumers, notably for low-income consumers in the US, are going to be bad, not to say terrible. What the example also, however, shows is that economics is an orthodoxy, and when an orthodoxy is challenged, it responds with indignation and threats of the end of the world. And there really isn't a cow holier to economics than free trade. And there isn't anything on which economists, broadly speaking, agree more than the kind of tariffs that Trump has been levying are dumb and they really can't do much good. And so the scale of the reaction that you're seeing and have seen from economists reflects, not just the fact that they, broadly speaking, and correctly, I think, gauge that these will be bad for the American economy and for American society. They don't just reflect the fact that it's going to take a while for this to work its way through, but that what's being touched here are really kind of core convictions of a discipline which is as much faith in certain respects as it is empirical science. But on this, I think they have very good reason to think that, their faith is solidly founded in experience. And it will just take some time. But in the meantime, you're going to get this blowback of people just shocked. I mean, really shocked that such an important area of policy, and one which has been core to American politics since the late 19th century, and into which generations of effort have gone to try and make it more systematic and more scientific, quote unquote, has been reduced to back-of-the-envelope, boisterous, macho posturing by, an old guy in the White House. And there's a degree of just shock and incomprehension at that, and that's what's being articulated in these, expostulations, in these predictions of disaster, which you're alluding to.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of kind of the Project Fear approaches to kind of dissuade people of Brexit. Obviously, those effects, as you mentioned, in Britain's case, hit. And yeah, I suppose then the same goes for delayed effects when it comes to financial markets. I mean, the response we've seen in this early going is financial markets going up in the US, but I guess in the medium or long term, we can expect some effects to arrive there as well. But it wasn't just economists making predictions. It was also the Trump administration making predictions of its own about the effects of the tariffs. I mean, Trump is fond of claiming that tariffs will help return manufacturing to the United States. And I'm curious whether this experiment so far this year has produced any of those results. I mean, is there any sign that manufacturing is returning to the U.S. or are U.S. manufacturers already benefiting from tariffs in any way?
I mean, there's three different levels, I think, to think about this. One is the pure price effect of the tariffs, and it's early to be drawing any conclusions. They've come into effect in a really haphazard way. The variable you're trying to affect is investment. Investment is made over long term, or at least the medium term. You'd have to be out of your mind to have conditioned any substantial investment decision on the totally haphazard direction of tariff policy making since the advent of the Trump administration. The only thing is they're probably going up, but who knows by how much. And furthermore, the effects of tariff increases of the type that Trump has been pushing through, notably the really heavy sectoral tariffs on things like steel and aluminium, are very, very ambiguous as far as the broader American manufacturing sector is concerned, because there are as many, or far more, in fact, steel and aluminium users in the United States, far, far more, than there are producers of steel and aluminium. So if you have a tariff which raises the price of aluminium and steel in the Midwest, as the Trump tariffs measurably have done and did during his first term as well, the main impact is to damage the competitive position of American manufacturing, whilst, of course, and handing a windfall to the standout manufacturers of steel and aluminium in the United States. The German car industry, in fact, can't decide whether it is more hurt by the tariff agreement with Europe or, in fact, more benefiting from the higher costs of steel and aluminium that manufacturers in the US now have to pay. So that's an inherently ambiguous thing. What is less ambiguous, but hard to assess in its overall economic impact, are the stream of discrete investment decisions by really large global players, which the Trump administration is trumpeting on the White House website. The Biden people did the same thing. And what you see there is kind of, glad handing, invitations to the White House, conference calls with the president type negotiation with the leaders of not just American but global business, in which what Trump seeks to do is, the details of tariffs aside, to basically strong arm or persuade major corporate players into investing giant amounts of money. Like, the announcements are huge, like the project Stargate, this AI, OpenAI, Oracle, SoftBank project, that's $500 billion. Apple announced $500 billion investment in the United States, and then another $100 billion this week. Nvidia is also in the $500 billion range. Micron Technology, $200 billion. IBM, $150 billion. I mean, these are huge numbers that are clocking up, but these aren't, specifically tariff related. These are corporate announcements extracted by a phone call from the president of the United States, who says, believe me when I say this is where you need to invest and produce. And corporate leadership decides it's probably a good idea to say yes and announce a really big number. What that will in due course translate into, I think we have to wait and see. That's the only sensible thing. The third level at which one can gauge the effect of policy like this, and it's really too early for this to be fair, but it's not just calculations about the market impact of price changes as a result of tariffs or headline-making announcements by individual businesses, but what shows up in the American macroeconomic statistics in terms of actual investment spend by businesses on the ground in the American GDP numbers. And those figures are not bad so far, but they don't suggest any trend break, any dramatic acceleration compared to the already accelerating numbers under Biden. And in the long run, it's really hard to see how all of this uncertainty can be good for business investment. But on the other hand, there are these huge headline numbers that have been announced. But that's all paper stuff so far, right? That's political. You come off the phone with the president and you say, well, he was satisfied with $500 billion. And then you see what happens next. So those would be the three things that I would be looking at. The specific market effects, and I'd expect those to be very ambiguous. The headline grabbing things, which we know Trump loves to do, the deal. In the end, it'll be the macroeconomic numbers. And of course, the big worry with the Trump administration is they seem determined to silence the American statistical machinery. This is a topic we should really come back to if it doesn't produce the kind of macro numbers they like.
Yeah, I mean, it does strike me there's a relationship between the first and second of your points there, in the sense that, we've discussed before how, big companies can maybe negotiate exceptions for themselves to tariff regimes. And it's, I guess, not a coincidence that it is big companies that are making these investment announcements. They're the ones maybe with Trump's phone number at hand, while smaller companies may be forced to swallow the increase in costs that you were describing there. But yeah, it's not only big companies trying to negotiate deals for themselves. It's various countries around the world, as the Trump administration itself was sort of proud to announce that countries were lining up to negotiate deals with the U.S. as it moved to put these tariffs into place. Among those global players was the European Union. Europe, after months of negotiation, struck a deal with the Trump administration. And the terms of that deal came under criticism in Europe, and the Trump administration seemed pretty proud of to tout those terms. Europe basically now will be facing a 15% tariff for its goods that it exports to the U.S., that the U.S. imports from Europe, and won't be imposing any tariff in return on American goods. So I'm curious how one assesses this kind of deal. I mean, does it strike you as a sign of weakness for Europe, or should we really be thinking of this in broader terms as a kind of sign of realism by Europe in terms of its relationship with the United States?
I mean, it's tempting to combine those two and say, well, it's realism in the face of weakness, right? I mean, the weakness here is not on the trade side. Europe is America's largest trading partner when you add it all up, right? And in the conventional kind of comparisons where you look at countries, so you have Mexico, Canada, China in the leading countries with which America trades, but the EU, Europe is a block for trade policy purposes. And so really the only sensible comparison is to include it. And when you do, it's America's leading trading partner, and it would have considerable leverage over the United States. In fact, there was a team, Brexit-hardened, Brexit-experienced trade negotiating team, who were supposedly developing an anti-Trump package of sanctions that was supposed to be put in place. They have a thing called the anti-coercion instrument, which was, supposed to be used against the likes of China and Russia, but they were teeing up apparently to use against Trump, and then von der Leyen, as the EU Commission president, backed down and cut this deal. And I think it's generally understood that this was done because of Ukraine. This is part of a package in which Europe has maneuvered its way through this summer without the big blow up with Trump, which was feared. And the thing that scared them most was Ukraine. And Trump's apparently now increasingly persistent shift to a much more skeptical view towards Russia, the Europeans will reckon as a huge win. And given the stresses and strains of having to mobilize Europe to mount a much more effective self-defense, it seemed a small price to pay to keep the Americans sweet by doing this deal. And part of that deal is also a promise to buy American defense equipment, which comes easily given that it's going to be quite hard for Europe to produce in short order, at least, or indeed over the medium term, notably the ballistic missile defense shield, which is probably the highest priority, or probably ought to be the highest priority for European defense spending, because that's the way that Russia can most obviously affect Europe. And so I think in general, I would say it was an act of realism in the face of recognized weakness. It was disappointing for those who thought of Europe as a stand-up defender of the, rules-based international order and WTO norms, which is how one lot of, commentators expected Europe to act. There is no doubt that by succumbing to Trump's pressure, Europe removes yet another obstacle to the Trumpification of global trade policy. That's and it didn't help in their subsequent negotiations with China. A further reading, however, of this deal is that, as with the corporate deals or with the Trump deal with Ukraine, which we talked about on the show months ago now, another reading will be that this was pure cynicism. Because a key element of this deal are promises by the EU, which it has no business to make and has no way of delivering on. The most notable of which is the promise by the EU to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American energy, and above all LNG, over the next 3 years. The target is in the $650 billion range. That's 3 times as much energy from the US as Europe currently buys. There is no demand for it. Europe has alternative sources of supply. Even if it zeroes out all imports from Russia, there isn't enough demand in the European system to soak that up. And crucially, Europe's not a state-run planned economy. So the Brussels Commission is not in a position to promise that European energy companies are going to soak up $200 billion worth of US energy. They don't make the decision. This isn't, the whole thing has about it this sort of, Lego brick, children's playground kind of view of international economics, in which Europe is an actor and America is an actor, and Trump is the man that brings benefits for the US economy by doing these deals. And if, Europe was China, you could say maybe there would be some substance to this, though even in China, the decision-making system is more complex than this. But in Europe, they just sold him, they sold him something which doesn't exist. He can go away and say, well, I got this huge deal. And Brussels people will go, well, yeah, that's what he thinks. So, and then the question is, what happens next? How carefully will they monitor? The Trump administration has threatened to put the Japanese, I think, on a quarterly monitoring system. But the Europeans are not going to devise a bunch of, instruments to force their energy companies to gobble up American gas they don't want. Either either it comes at a price the Europeans want it and there's demand for it, or they don't. And if there isn't, it won't. The market's not there. And that's a reason why America currently doesn't run huge trade surpluses with Europe, is that Europe doesn't fundamentally want American goods. So that would be the third reading, that this is a sticking plaster, that, you're basically playing on the fact that Trump, has high vanity and very, very low attention span. And so the idea is you just keep feeding him these sugar highs and hope for the best.
Yeah, though I suppose the risk there is that if this does cross Trump's attention again, that the United States could again threaten higher rates of tariffs.
You'd have to do it all over again.
And as you mentioned, Europe, because of its geopolitical position, can't deter these threats. And I guess for me, that raises the question, what we've learned about these tariff threats as geopolitical tool. I mean, effectively, they are threats of sanctions that the administration has adopted universally. And, to some extent, in Europe's case, they seem to have been effective. But yeah, more generally, how should we assess these tariff threats as a geopolitical tool? I mean, how are these threats now working in other cases? I'm thinking specifically of India, which has come into the administration's focus most recently, and Russia, which is now also the object of some sanction threats.
I thought this was a super interesting question, and I agree with you that, like, if you're going to cite an example of where the tariffs have worked best, it would be against Europe. But I think this goes to the underlying theory of the world that Trump has, because he's not like a thoroughgoing realist, right? He's not really a red in tooth and claw kind of realist calculating engine, right? Trump has this weird view. I think, I thinking about it, I thought maybe one could describe it as like a Gulliver's Travels view of geopolitics. Like, he basically thinks of the United States as a sleeping giant that has somehow been tied down by exploitative relationships by a bunch of smaller countries, which are not as powerful as the US, but have exploited the fact that it's had dopey liberal leadership for all these decades, really since the 1980s. Trump's been banging on about this. And so all of these smaller powers have ganged up on the United States to extract surplus. And what needs to happen to put the world to right is that Trump wakes America up, it flexes its muscles, and then in a matter of weeks, if not days, if not hours, all these small countries will realize how the cookie crumbles and where the power actually lies. And they'll all fall into line and do deals with America, and they'll just queue up. And there'll be this big flowback of resource that's long overdue to the United States, which is the result of all of their thieving over all these years. I think some sort of model like that, right? And with regard to Europe, like, of all the places in the world, that's probably like the one that you could maybe apply the Gulliver model to, like systematic free riding, both in terms of export surpluses and defense, like by a bunch of medium-sized to small countries that can all be bullied into line. But like, with regard to the people you mentioned, like the Chinas, the Indias, the Russias, the Brazils of this world, that's just not a plausible model, right? It just doesn't work. I mean, especially India is particularly fascinating. I mean, with regard to Russia, it's just silly. Anyone who thinks that Putin can be moved by a tariff is bonkers. And anyone who thinks that Lula can be intimidated over the Bolsonaro case and the Brazilian Supreme Court and a near military coup by Trump threatening tariffs is also like out to lunch, right? So the Indian case is the one that's really fascinating. And they must be in New Delhi. They must be so puzzled, right? Because the Trumpian accusation is India buys Russian oil. But like, behind the scenes, everyone understood that the entire design of the Biden era anti-Russian tariffs was to encourage India to buy Russian oil at massively discounted prices, right? The aim was not to hurt India, which was considered a swing variable and couldn't be shown to. Modi can't afford to be, seen to be intimidated by the Americans and fall into line. They need the oil, so the idea was to set a cap on the prices so that India could basically take advantage of Russia. That was the whole game plan. That was the whole design of the oil price cap. Right? That was the whole design. And so the Indians went ahead and did it. Now, all of a sudden, someone in the Trump administration has woken up and gone, you're breaking. It's truly bizarre. And the Modi people will have thought that they were a key strategic piece in the American, quad jigsaw puzzle against China. And a key element of that is the manufacturing of, smartphones by Apple in India. And all of a sudden, you've now got this huge pressure on Apple to relocate all their production to the United States, whereas the whole plan was to use India as the way to move Apple out of China. And then Trump comes along and says, well, what I really need you to do is to allow American agro industry into the Indian food market. And Modi just kind of goes, you can do, Trump, whatever you damn well like with American farmers. And Trump is famously like not really fully coherent on this because he doesn't understand the complex politics. But Modi does. Modi's like a properly skilled democratic mass politician. And he knows that hundreds of millions of people in India depend on small peasant farming. Like, this is classic, real democratic politics, not the make-believe shit that Trump does. And so Modi just kind of looks at him and goes like, what are you talking about? No way. He does the reverse move and says, I am now going to defend India's farmers against intrusive American agro-capitalism. And, Modi was in political trouble. This will suit him very well, I imagine. It'll be like a Carney type move. Plus, in any case, India's mainly interested in the service sector, and Trump's barely talking about that. So, I mean, it's utterly bamboozling, I think. And the more this rolls out, the more perverse and kind of crazy it gets. You can sense like the Indian financial markets don't know what to make of it. They haven't sold off massively. There's been a quake. It's not been great, obviously, but it's so contrary to the flow of policy and the direction of travel, over recent years, that it's up there with that Penguin Island. Like, to think that somehow the logic of US trade policy with India should be governed by this Trumpian calculus. And the more I think about it, the more it seems to me one of the more telling and profound misunderstandings of, and this is core Republican stuff, right? The people the American strategists who opened up the India angle were Bush, like in 2005, right? This was the big Republican geopolitical play. It made lots of sense historically, and the people around Trump, they just can't add this stuff up. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, precisely. I mean, there's no recognition or acknowledgement, rather, that this would mark a broader reversal.
It's just another case. It's just another country.
Yeah.
What do they call it? What do you call it? A dead economy or something? Like, it's the most rapidly growing economy in the world, for crying out loud. Right? Which part of the memo did you not get?
I mean, for me, this raises the question of where Marco Rubio is.
Where are the people that should be selling him? No, sir. Actually, it's kind of like it's an important piece. This,
not least Rubio is the traditional Republican, ostensibly, but also he is also the de facto national security advisor. The role that consists of kind of bringing all these priorities together and trying to synthesize them. There's no real evidence of that going on. And since
when was buying Russian oil a crime in the Trumpian book?
You tell me, but wouldn't the effect of cutting off all purchases of Russian oil be an increase in oil prices for everyone, including U.S. consumers? But
Trump doesn't. It's not clear what Trump wants on that score, right? Because he wants on the one hand to be great.
Yeah. Well, again, calling Marco Rubio. We'll see if he shows up to the office, but we should take a break here. We will be back though in a second to talk about Gaza's hunger crisis. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is 62,000. That is the number of tons of food that is required monthly to meet the needs of the population of Gaza. That is according to Israel's own figures, tabulated by its own government. And of course, Israel over the last several months has not been meeting those basic needs, and the result is starvation in Gaza. In the months of March and April, the amount of food that entered Gaza was 0. And in May, June, and July, that trickled up a bit, but not nearly meeting that 62,000 ton threshold. Again, the result has been the world observing the starvation of Gaza's population as a result of this policy. Adam, this obviously has been a big topic. We haven't addressed it on this podcast yet, but I wanted to start off by asking you about this ongoing starvation as a result of this policy in Gaza and the allegations of genocide that Israel has been facing. How do these two allegations relate to one another? I mean, Israel's openly been pursuing a policy of siege of Gaza, and I'm curious, should we just be thinking of siege itself as a crime of murder more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think siege is another word for indiscriminate mass murder when it's taken to the extent that the Israelis have. I would also say that, I think it's important to avoid euphemistic and fundamentally misleading and tendentious language in talking about this. Right? There are famines around the world which are appropriately described as crisis, truly complex polycrisis type situations like Sudan, for instance. There are perpetrators of violence there and the people deliberately using starvation there as well. But it's not to be compared to the fishbowl siege type situation that we have in Gaza, where there's 2 million people essentially at the mercy of the Israelis, and they're very deliberately and quite intentionally and quite explicitly stated intention of reducing the food supply to critical levels, and the consequence we are seeing. So this clearly meets the standard of a deliberate policy, which then forces the connection to genocide. Because if you go back genealogically to the founding moment, the moment where this concept was developed by the Polish Jewish intellectual Raphael Lemkin, in exile during World War II, trying to make sense of the situation in Poland at the time. In 1944, he coined the concept of genocide and a deliberate starvation of both the Jewish and the non-Jewish Polish population was very, very much on his mind. In fact, if you'd stop the clock at the end of 1941, the largest mass murder perpetrated by the Nazi regime would have been the forced starvation of the Soviet prisoners of war, who were taken prisoner by them in the first phase of the invasion of the Soviet Union. If you look back to the 1930s, the largest mass murders perpetrated by the Stalinist regime were the utterly merciless, ruthless policies of collectivization and the diversion of grain, say from Ukraine in the 30s. Those dwarf the numbers that were killed in the purges, right, the politically driven killing. So at the foundation of our modern thinking about these crimes, these mass crimes, these modern mass crimes, which genocide is the label for, the deliberate policy of starvation was squarely and fully incorporated. And in the 1948 definition of genocide passed by the UN General Assembly, it's right there as the third point. So killing members of the group is point A, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group is point B, imposing measures to prevent births is point D, forcibly transferring children is point E, but point C is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And that's clearly what we're witnessing in Gaza at this moment before our eyes. And with what's incredible in this case, a smoking gun paper trail of responsibility and deliberation in plain view, and a fair amount of public celebration of this policy by both official Israelis and non-official sources. So it's as clear-cut a case as one could. It's a horrendous and very, very clear-cut case.
Yeah, that's a useful description. I mean, I think useful to not to sanitize these war policies. I mean, I guess wonder when we're talking about history, I guess, whether we should be, retrospectively be thinking about genocide is more common in some sense. I mean, when we talk about sieges, the siege of Leningrad in World War II, say, I mean, or other sieges. I mean, should we be thinking of those then all as examples of kinds of mass crimes of this kind then as well?
So my view on the Nazi regime is that it was involved in at least 3 layered programs that all meet the standard of genocide. The first that immediately comes to mind is the Judeocide. Then there is the Hunger Plan program, which included the deliberate starvation of the population of Leningrad, but also the Soviet prisoners of war. And then further down the line, the settler colonial program of the Generalplan Ost, which envisioned the enslaving, the displacement of 30 to 40 million people. So stacked, the Wannsee plan for the final solution of the Jewish question, so-called, is 12 million people. The starvation plans, the hunger plan, is in the order of 20 to 30 million people. That's the entire urban population of the Western Soviet Union. And the settler colonial plan for Eastern Europe is even more grandiose. That's 50 million plus people to be displaced, dispersed, ultimately worked to death. So even in the Nazi case, there are there's a stacking of different visions of mass murder. The same is true with settler colonialism as a project, right? The point is not, as it were, focus a critique on a particular country. Australia, Canada, the United States, Brazil, Russia are all products of, British rule in Ireland, are all products of Algeria, settler colonial. These are very generic, terrible crimes committed in the course of modernity. Yeah.
And I suppose because of then how prolific these crimes have been, maybe we have now some knowledge about how starvation develops as a phenomenon in terms of what's happening in Gaza. I mean, is there a tipping point beyond which we say starvation has really set in as a social phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I think we can start with physiology, which is something that was explored quite extensively in the course of World War II, and in fact quite deliberately by the Germans, who figured out base metabolism, in part because they weren't interested in keeping people on base metabolism alive, because they're no good for working, right? So if you feed men on less than 1,400 calories a day, you don't get an adequate worker. So if you've got 3,000 calories, you can either split it between two people and have two people who can't work, or you can have one person who can work. So you can draw the conclusions. So there is, yes, quite a lot of understanding of the physiology of this, and it's quite clear that human organisms, broadly speaking, we think that a fully fed human put in a state of starvation dies between 40 and 60 days after the onset of starvation. And it's an absolutely agonizing and merciless way to die, because the body consumes itself. And from about week 4 onwards, that process becomes very hard to reverse, because the body is beginning to consume bone, and the body is decomposing itself because it desperately tries to mobilize resources. And that's clearly the sort of symptom that we are beginning to see amongst the worst affected people in Gaza. In classic famines, which are not the result of deliberate policy, or are deliberate policy acting on agricultural systems, so not urban spaces like Gaza with a food supply from the outside or from its own farms, but to cities, the most dangerous moment is generally the late spring and early summer before the harvest has come in, because that's when you're furthest from the last full harvest. And so people die in the spring, classically. And there's this agonizing moment where they wait for the new harvest to come in, and people are driven to the desperate resort of eating the harvest before it's fully ripened in the fields, which then destroys any prospect of surviving into the next year. So classically, in really large-scale agrarian-based famines, it's 2 years in a row that produce the utterly devastating effects, because you can just about get through that first year, but then the attritional effect on the harvest of the early eating of what's left means you don't really have a harvest the second year. In a modern economy, that's a sort of supply chain effect. So you consume the resources in the supply chain, and then there's nothing left to work with. In the German case after World War II, for instance, they ate their way through the resources of the supply chain in the last months of the war, and then suffered not famine, but acute nutritional scarcity in the first post-war winter as a result of that policy. Those kind of things are normal, and they give you a timeline. But classically, really, and famines, and this is what we've learned from people like Amartya Sen, the great political economist, famines are economic events. The people that starve are the most vulnerable physiologically, so that's the elderly and the young, but also the people who are poor, right? Because almost by definition, if you're rich, at the point where the choice is to die or to eat, all of your resource goes on food. And so what you see in Gaza right now is that this is an economic crisis. It's a cost of living crisis. The people who are dying are the people who, for whatever reason, cannot access whatever food is left as prices escalate. And this gives you another way of timing a famine, which is what is the moment at which different strata of the population run out of economic resource to enable them to buy whatever food is left in the black market. So you see this classically, say, in the Warsaw Ghetto, where you will have these photos lugubriously taken by German observers of the ghetto, where you will see relatively well-fed Jewish upper middle-class families next to people visibly starving in the street. I mean, we see that, of course, in extreme situations in the developing world, or indeed in American cities on a bad day, right? And that's just an effect, basically, of a scarcity economy in which the people with economic resource rescue themselves to the top of the nutritional pyramid and can sustain a reasonably normal life for a while, as the people at the bottom literally fall off the cliff and die. So and that gives you a way of timing this out. Like, when will people's budgets run out? When will they run out of things to trade for food?
I suppose this raises the question of if food would be arriving in Gaza. I mean, who at this point would be capable of distributing aid in coordinated fashion to the Gazan population? I mean, the UN has been restricted from operating. They would traditionally have a role to play, but does it have to be the UN? I mean, is this something that anyone could potentially do? I mean, Israel has set up its own Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and that's pretty clearly failed. But is that basically just a willful failure at this point? I mean, is that something that Israel easily could do if it wanted to?
No, it's very difficult to feed starving populations in an orderly fashion, right? Because the question has got to be, why is the starvation in the first place? More often than not, this is a result of the collapse of power. This is a very unusual situation that we're in, because it's such a clear-cut case of deliberate starvation from the outside. But famously, Israel doesn't want to have a conversation about the day after. So no one is thinking hard about authority structures in Gaza itself. There's a callous disregard for the competence and authority, and in fact, a denunciation of the UN bodies, which were doing this incredibly difficult work of mediating between the inside, the cauldron, the pressure cooker of pressure within Gaza and the outside world. The UN was cut out. The Israelis put and the Americans put this ghastly, ramshackle, essentially militarized private sector agency in, and through a combination of hubris, incompetence, a lack of clear political grip on the ground, have created this terror zone around the distribution points. But the deep logic here is clear, right? The condition under which markets normally function is one in which it isn't in the end just men with guns who decide who eats and who doesn't, right? Because we've got all these mediating layers in between of property rights and law and money and sufficiency, right? But when you take that away, when you remove the adequacy, when you strip this down to the bare bones of the just not being enough stuff, then all of the power that remains within society will quite naturally cluster around the question of who gets food and who organizes it and who distributes it. And so the immediate allegation, of course, against Hamas was that Hamas was stealing the aid deliveries. That turns out New York Times, and let's just cite the New York Times, they think there's no serious evidence for this. What there clearly is evidence for is banditry. And what would you expect? Of course, you've got desperate young men who are either trying to feed themselves or their families or just their clan or their group, who will try and use whatever muscle they can to grab this stuff. The Israelis apparently are in cahoots with at least one militia organization. Why? Because they're afraid that Hamas will get back into the business of policing the food chain, which will give Hamas power and legitimacy, and that's the one thing they want to prevent happening. But Hamas are actually the only people on the ground, by way of the residual elements of the Gaza police authority, who have any grip on the situation. And the Israelis, when they see anyone with Hamas connection and authority and a gun, bomb them. So, we're in this, nightmarish situation where to feed a population in this level of desperation, I mean, the real surprises, and it's a testament, I think, to the coherence of his Palestinian society, that it hasn't disintegrated even more than it apparently has. We're not getting that much reporting on the brutal day-to-day realities of this on the ground, not as much as would allow us to really reconstruct the power plays. That'll be for retrospective reconstruction. But from the reports we do get about these moments at which the Israelis haphazardly intervene, or their sponsorship of various anti-Hamas militias on the ground, it's clear that this whole question of how you feed food in has become, as you would expect, just massively politicized.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that at a moment of disorder, political legitimacy would be defined by who has access to the food, right? I mean, rather than sort of preceding that question. Yeah, I suppose that explains some of what's been happening. Another result of this phenomenon is that various countries have been responding to this starvation by announcing that they would recognize or be prepared to recognize Palestinian statehood. And I wanted to ask about the connection between those two facts. I mean, is there a direct connection between, the recognition of Palestinian statehood and alleviation of this humanitarian plight that's happening there? I mean, how do the crimes that Gazans are suffering, how exactly, do they bear on this kind of political recognition?
Well, I think the progressive delegitimization of Israel as a result of the crimes its authorities are committing in Gaza, or before the eyes of the world, forced Western governments' hand. But I would agree with you that the connection to the Gaza situation is tenuous. Where it's not tenuous is the West Bank, right? Because this is two-pronged offensive. I mean, the annihilation of the Palestinian society in Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of Gaza is one wing, and the other wing because clearly the Netanyahu and co have just decided to bite the bullet, is to erase once and for all the possibility of a two-state solution by means of a massive influx of and a huge upping of the aggression of settlers in the West Bank and the progressive erosion and eating away of any kind of resemblance of a coherent and Palestinian entity there. And the two things go together. But the West, notably the Europeans, are very unevenly invested in these two things, right? The Gaza, because of Hamas, is a deep embarrassment to them. They don't know what to do. They're so far in bed with the Israelis on that they're kind of stuck. So they can't move hard there because of Hamas. So, but they need to do something because what Israel is doing is this giant international disgrace. And so they need to move forward on something they are quite invested in, which is the two-state solution. Not because the two-state solution actually is compelling to anyone. I've not met anyone on, either from the Palestinian or the Israeli side who any longer believes that's viable. But the Europeans are deeply committed to that because that's the only sticking plaster they've got. And so Israel's offensive on the two-state, on the settler front in the West Bank is actually the thing that's neuralgic for them. The Knesset passed a resolution saying, there will be no two-state solution. The Netanyahu government said there will be no negotiations. And so the Europeans, led by the French, have decided this is an opportune moment with the images of the starvation going on to actually step up on that front. And I think that's the way it relates. The impact on Gaza, I think, is actually quite ambiguous. And you could put it this way, which is that if Palestine is a state, then did Palestine declare war on Israel on October 7th, 2023, right? And obviously the standard answer is clearly not. It was Hamas that did. But if you declare Israel as a Palestine a state and Gaza part of it, and Hamas, by any measure, clearly the dominant political force there, you end up going down that route. And so then you end up in this position where you have a meeting chaired by France and Saudi Arabia in which simultaneously everyone is signed up on Palestinian statehood, everyone wants a ceasefire, and they're calling on Hamas to disarm, right? Which basically just means Hamas should concede surrender. And so I think that, which is they're not willing to do. So they will release hostages and they'll agree to a ceasefire, but they're not going to agree to complete disarmament. That would be a disaster for them politically. So the two things are linked in quite a perverse way when we're talking about the connection in Gaza.
Yeah, I had not considered that aspect, but yeah, we obviously will continue to be watching this, and we'll see how the Gazan suffering develops in the weeks ahead. But yeah, if it comes to pass that Palestine gets broader recognition as a state, yeah, that could be a reason for us to do a segment on the Palestinian economy per se at some point. But yeah, for now, we'll bring this conversation to a close. As always, we'll be back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.